In this module, we'll examine the third and last of the real-life cases that Rachel's looks at. This is the case of Tracy Latimer. Tracy was born with cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is a spectrum disorder that's been documented all the way back to Hippocrates, who was a physician in the 5th century BCE. So it's nothing novel or new. Specifically, cerebral palsy is a group of primitive movement disorders appearing in early childhood. The signs or the symptoms of cerebral palsy are going to vary in severity between individuals. The symptoms include poor coordination, stiff muscles, weak muscles, and tremors. There can be problems with sensation, vision, hearing, swallowing, and speaking. Oftentimes, babies that have cerebral palsy don't roll over, they don't sit or crawl or walk as early as other children of their age. Other symptoms can include seizures. Tracy had these problems, and problems with thinking or reasoning, either of which occurred about 1/3 of the cases of cerebral palsy. While the symptoms may get more noticeable over the first few years of life, the underlying problems do not necessarily worsen over time. Cerebral palsy is probably the most common movement disorder in children. It occurs in about 2 out of 1,000 live births, so it's relatively common. As I said, it's a spectrum disease. It can be milder or more severe. Severe cases can be especially serious, as in Tracy's case, which was quite severe. In fact, her seizures caused her to have multiple operations, and she was going to face more surgeries in the future. It was the assessment of her father and her doctors that she was in severe chronic pain, and she would likely remain in severe pain for the rest of her life. She was also wasting. It was determined that she had the mentality of a 3-year-old, so she had severe thinking and reasoning problems, and so this is a pretty severe and troubling case of cerebral palsy. So when we look at the case facts, then we see that Tracy had severe cerebral palsy, she had the mentality of a 3-year-old, she was wasting away and in constant pain, and her father ultimately killed her. The case question is, was it wrong of Mr. Latimer to kill Tracy? The first argument that we're going to consider isn't really explicitly formulated in the way the other arguments are. I've formulated it though, and I call it the argument from mercy. We start off again with a general moral principle. If an innocent person has or will always lack autonomy and is suffering, then it is permissible to kill them. Tracy satisfied the criteria in the first premise. Therefore, it's morally permissible to kill her. Now, Rachel's doesn't explicitly formulate this argument, but he does basically give us this argument in the first paragraph there. And he seems to evaluate it as possibly sound. He seems to think that this is a reasonable argument and that it's not obvious that Mr. Latimer did something wrong when he killed Tracy. Let's consider the next argument. This is an argument against the idea that Mr. Latimer did nothing wrong when killing Tracy. We call it the argument from the wrongness of discriminating against the handicapped. It's wrong to discriminate against people, specifically to treat them differently for no good reason. Tracy was killed because she was handicapped by cerebral palsy, not for a good reason. Therefore, Tracy was discriminatorily and wrongly killed. Now, Rachel's evaluates this argument as possibly unsound, and the reason that he gives us for that is he suggests that Mr. Latimer's claim that Tracy was suffering and had no current or prospective autonomy is plausibly a good reason to treat her differently. So the notion here is that discriminating against anyone, whether it's the handicapped or anyone else, is discriminating against them, that is, treating them differently, even though there is no good reason to treat them differently. And what Rachel suggests in his evaluation of this argument is the fact that she was in chronic, severe pain and that she had no current or prospective autonomy. Those are things that we might consider reasons to treat her differently. Let's look at the last argument in the Tracy Latimer case. We can call this the slippery slope argument. It starts off with this assertion. If we allow killing in cases like Tracy's, it will break down the prohibition on killing. Ultimately, then, the prohibition will be eroded by exception after exception until life is cheap. Therefore, killing Tracy is wrong. Now, Rachel's evaluates this argument as possibly unsound, and what he suggests is that while he recognizes the sanctity of human life as a cornerstone of contemporary Western morality, and he thinks that concerns about the cheapening of life are serious and important to take into account, he nevertheless feels that the argument relies on highly speculative claims about the consequences of mercy killing. The idea here is that if we allow any exceptions, then what will happen is everything will continue to be chipped away at until eventually the principle really doesn't exclude anything. Sometimes you hear this when people talk about drug laws or about laws having to do with LGBTQ rights and so on. The idea that if we allow for an exception in one case, even if it's principle, then that will just break the dam. And what we'll see is a total devolution of the principle